days.
But the Israelis
incomprehensible today.
Because they
the third
had
this
over a period of
culture
50
innovation
days,
and improvisation.
the Soviets sustained almost 450
stop doing it and find another way. And that is the watchword inside the Israeli Defense Force. And they take terrible losses at the beginning because they were completely unprepared for this air defense umbrella over this enormous defensive position on the other side of the Suez. And as a result, they lose hundreds of tanks, they lose a lot of aircraft, they stop, they fall back, and they start talking about what has happened, and they begin to put together new tactics, new approaches that will work. And there's a wonderful example. One young battalion commander, he had about 300 men in his reconnaissance battalion. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Brome. Unfortunately, he did not survive the war. But once the Egyptians have established themselves, he manages to find a seam between two Egyptian armies. He moves down that seam all the way to the Suez Canal and finds a potential crossing site that is completely unoccupied. And he manages to get in and to get out without ever being detected. That turns out to be the game changer. That becomes the crossing site. That is where the Israelis concentrate their effort. The outcome, of course, is a dramatic crossing and the complete collapse of the Egyptian command structure, because the Egyptian command structure finds out 24 hours after the Israelis have actually crossed the canal that the Israelis are over the canal. They begin to get reports of tanks and long-range Israeli artillery destroying air defenses 24 hours after the Israelis have crossed. The lines of communication have completely collapsed. And when the Egyptian Air Force tries to intervene, of course, it's shot out of the sky. But the Egyptians make an interesting decision. They make the decision to stand firm, to hold what they've got. And that turns out to be a good decision, because once the conflict ends with the intervention of the United States and the Soviet Union, the Egyptians are able to hold on to territory and insist on the return of the Sinai. And the outcome is actually a very good one in the history of warfare, because both sides get something they wanted. The Israelis wanted a secure border with Egypt, and the Egyptians wanted the return of the Sinai for reasons of their national honor. So it's a very positive thing. The last battle, the 73 Easting. And I've got to tell you, the 73 Easting is an interesting one, because I think it shows the American soldier at his best. Just as we've talked about the brilliant performance of the individual German soldier, the Israeli soldier, the American soldier in the 73 Easting turns in an exceptional performance. And I want to give you a quick insight into the American soldier and his mentality. Shortly before we deployed to the border with Saudi Arabia and then began our invasion, if you will, of Iraq, we were much deeper inside Saudi Arabia, but we had sent one troop up to the border with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And this was called Ghost Troop, G Troop. There are some members of Ghost Troop in the audience, by the way, who were there with me. And Ghost Troop has the mission to defend this log base and to defend along the border. All of a sudden, I'm wakened. I think I was trying to get some sleep. It was in the evening, about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And one of the NCOs said, the duty officer wants you to come over to the Tactical Operations Center right away. This is a couple of weeks before we actually went into Iraq. And I walked in there. I said, what's going on? And he said, well, the squadron's on alert. We have information that Ghost Troop is under artillery fire. I alerted regiment. Well, suddenly you had the entire 2nd Armored Cavalry Battle Group, which was about almost 5,000 in the regiment, plus a reinforcing artillery brigade, some 7,000. Everyone is up, everyone's mounted, vehicles are running. And into the headquarters, or this Tactical Operations Center, walks in a non-commissioned officer. He happened to be my master gunner. And he said, what's going on? And so the duty officer said, Sergeant, we have a report here that says Ghost Troop is taking artillery fire up on the border with Saudi Arabia. And he said, oh, so we all want to rush right up there and get under it with them? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And of course, it didn't make any sense. So I said, well, wait a minute, show me the original report. And the original report came in as follows. I have air-to-ground bombs at my location. So I thought, this is rather odd. I've never heard of bombs that did not fall from the air to the ground. Are there ground-to-air bombs? I've only heard of air-to-ground bombs. Well, you can bet what had happened. This poor guy, and this is, remember, people are nervous. Everyone's green. There's only one man in my 1,100-man battle group that had actually seen action in Vietnam, and he's my operations sergeant major, a tall, distinguished black man named Ketchings. None of us had really seen action before, and so it's natural. He had seen these flares coming out of A-10s that were flying over Kuwait and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and he thought, well, these are bombs. And of course, they were there to confuse the enemy's air defenses. But that's the sort of thing that inevitably happens in every war. But the key thing here is that when we finally closed with the enemy, the level of training was excellent. The quality of the equipment was first rate, but the intelligence of the individual soldier was decisive. Units in battle have to be self-organizing. They can't be micromanaged. I know you've seen the movies, and you've seen somebody who sort of stands there and drops his sword and everybody attacks. Everything looks controlled. Forget it. Once you issue the order, advance, which I did, you're out of control. You have to depend on everyone at every level to think and execute the battle drill, execute the mission. And the one thing I did once we went into the attack was stop it at about 30 minutes, maybe 20 to 30 minutes into the attack. And the reason I stopped it was that I looked up and there was nothing there anymore to shoot at. And so then I began to worry, where are we? And so I got on, I said, battle stations, Cougar 3, halt. I say again, halt all operations. And so this juggernaut of 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns, stopped. Boom. And then I said, find out where we are. Because it's a desert, you know, there are no road signs out there, no little towns. And it took some time. This was the beginnings of global positioning satellites. A scout called in and said, these are the coordinates. And we discovered that we were about 7-4. Eventually it was 738, almost 7-4, this north-south grid line. We, at that point, were about 4 kilometers, 2.5 to 3 miles beyond the limit of advance that the regiment had set for us. And subsequently, I was told to withdraw, and I became very irate, refused to go back. The deputy regimental commander told me that we could stay. We stayed. So we struck an annihilating blow, and we discovered that this was the Republican Guard, but ladies and gentlemen, it was the rear guard, because we had been held back so long, for so many days, that the main body of the Republican Guard Corps, a force of over 80,000, had already left. They had escaped over the Euphrates. And instead of allowing us to pursue at that point, we were told, stand by and wait for the divisions to catch up with you. Of course, this is 5:30 in the evening, and the divisions did not begin to reach us until after midnight. And what they shot and what they found was, in most cases, abandoned equipment and very few troops. Because, again, the one thing that was important in this war, the Republican Guard Corps, the foundation for Saddam Hussein's regime, had largely escaped. And that's why this is called the lost victory. That's one reason. Because no one in Washington had thought carefully through this business of what's the purpose of the operation, how are we going to execute it, and what do we want it to look like when it ends. And that is the theme through all of these battles. No one bothers to sit down and systematically ask those questions. And when you fail to do that, you end up in places like Stalingrad. You look around and say, now what? What's the point? The Japanese ended up mired in China, and we ended up on the Euphrates River watching as the Republican Guard on the other side slaughtered the rebels trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein. The ceasefire comes along, and Norman Schwarzkopf, as I recollect, he said he had the IQ of a genius, wrote out the terms that he was going to impose on the enemy and sent them back to Washington. The State Department reviewed it, the Pentagon reviewed it, the White House reviewed it. No one changed a word. Nothing. He got no guidance. They said, that's fine. And of course, we know the rest of the story. The Republican Guard had not been destroyed. Saddam Hussein was not going to be overthrown. And so subsequently, President Bush then begins this process of encouraging Shiites and Kurds to openly rebel. And they are slaughtered in great numbers as a result. But the official story is we never meant to change regimes in Iraq. We never meant to remove Saddam Hussein. But at the end of the process, all of us said, in 12 years, we'll be back. But the bigger picture of what happens in Desert Storm is that suddenly this peace that you saw in 1914 with the Germans and the aircraft and the smoke and the connectivity back to the artillery now becomes a machine on a scale that we can't even begin to imagine. And that is what shapes the battle today. That is what shapes warfare today. It is this revolution of intelligence, surveillance, and strike, the marriage of the two. The rapidity with which that strike can be directed with absolute accuracy and precision on the basis of that information. And that changes everything. We have not faced it. We own it, but we are no longer the sole proprietors. That capability now also resides with the Russians, with the Chinese, increasingly with the Iranians, and we're going to see it proliferate in unmanned and manned form. So, there we have it in a nutshell. You all made it through this far, so I hope you have lots of questions. Thank you very much.
The British Army of 1914 made up of volunteers, and the American forces of 1991, a professional army